We'll make a start. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Good Friday service in this very unusual format, but what's obviously becoming a whole lot more usual for a lot of us, both at work and to socialise. I hope you're all safe and well in these challenging and dare I say, unprecedented days. One of those new words that's getting used a lot, and for us, certainly it is anyway. It's a time of a very old and a very familiar celebration, but now to very new rules and unfamiliar behaviours. Social distancing, limited travel to what is essential only, home isolation, and on reflection, it made me laugh a little bit, something that would make my dear old dad very happy, and that is very thorough hand washing. He was never one for sticky fingers. And if I can just use a bit of Schwäbisch for a moment, wenn man von außerhalb kommt, is what he would used to intone. When you come in from outside, you wash your hands thoroughly. To say that my thoughts for this service have changed over the time since I received the service allocation earlier this year, in fact, late last year, that would be an understatement. At the time, we were on the high of a family holiday over summer in Europe and taking in the Christmas markets of Germany and then the sights of, thankfully, southern Italy, and then to arrive at the point that we are at today. Thankfully, there appears to be a glimmer of light, and what we're told is that, in fact, this very weekend, this Easter weekend, will be telling in how our country continues to cope with its challenge of flattening that curve. Do we all have the willpower to behave and to not succumb to the temptation to break out, particularly on a beautiful sunny day like today? Like everyone else who's wanting to soldier on in life, we've all had to use another very common term now, we've all had to pivot to continue. And adapting to this situation has been quite a challenge. Yet I personally absolutely refer to it as the new normal. I refuse to do that, as I certainly do not wish to regard it as anything normal. It's highly unusual, it's definitely abnormal, and I hope it becomes very unusual again soon. And I think I'm pretty safe in guessing that there are a fair number of homeschooling parents who would agree with me on that call. And yet, at this time of year and for this holy day, the forced changes to our usually very hectic lifestyles, it does provide some positive. It's the ideal opportunity to take stock, to reflect and contemplate, and for a change, look for a change, which is what these holy days above all require of us. This pandemic, this coronavirus, this microscopic threat to our existence is providing us with timely but a very unfortunate perspective. That's a concept I've been considering a lot lately. Perspective, context, if you like. How many freedoms did we take for granted as we are left grasping the government's enforced 4 essentials of life from the many that we'd enjoyed previously? Be these the choice to go and do whatever we want, whenever we want, and wherever we want, with as many people as we want to. Right down to the simple choice to go to the supermarket and find toilet paper on the shelf. And who would have thought that the next cohort of Aussie heroes after our firefighters from January would be the humble supermarket checkout chick? When I considered my own perspectives, 2 things really were driven home for me. And driven home, no pun intended, but firstly, I used to find the drive to Bentley for a service quite a hassle, and that was where today's service had been scheduled in Bentley. I've never considered driving to Bentley a privilege, and yet that's what it's now become. And secondly, you may have seen over the week, it was an Indian doctor who reminded us in the first world, we lucky Australians and so on, that our response, our life changes in response to the coronavirus demonstrate the many privileges we have. Social distancing is a privilege. Social distancing and isolation in a home is a privilege. We have homes that are large enough with enough rooms, enough space that we can actually isolate in. Washing your hands thoroughly is a privilege, to have fresh running water and soap or sanitizer as a substitute. The opportunity for many to work from home is a privilege. And of course, for those who have lost work, at least to have the safety net of the job keeper payments that are to come. Right down to the very simple things like our lucky Prime Minister's wife, who could rush out to buy jigsaw puzzles to keep the kids busy during those quiet, challenging days. And we are so privileged that many of us continue to look for loopholes in the many new regulations so that we can maintain as normal a life as possible. Or, on returning from our wonderful overseas jaunts, we are unhappy that we are forced into quarantine in a hotel room, maybe somewhere that we've actually come from, and we find that stifling and limiting. Clearly, not many of our generation have suffered incarceration or, like many of our elder members, internment. We are struggling so much because we are losing so much. And that, of course, means that we have so much to lose. We are so privileged. We are so wealthy in so many ways. And how wastefully we took all of that for granted. What a common theme for all of us over the years. Jesus frequently reminded his followers to pare back things to the bare minimum, the essentials. He encouraged us to consider the lilies in the fields and to focus not on our own material wealth, but the well-being of others and enriching others with love, kindness, and compassion. Thinking of Jesus brings us to our text for today. It's from the Gospel of Luke in chapter 23, and it's the verses 1 to 25. And I've referred to the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible for my reading. It is 25 verses, so it's relatively long, but I'll share them with you now. And it's the judgment, if you like, of Jesus. So Jesus before Pilate. Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began, even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. The same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people. And here I have examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us." This was a man who had been put in prison for insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they had wished. That's the end of the text. As always, there's so much to unpack, especially in a text of this length. You might choose to do that yourself later in the day. The scene that follows the account of Jesus' crucifixion, like a common criminal, as there were either side of him on Golgotha, and the suffering that he endured has become the symbol we all recognise in the crucifix that adorns so many churches and homes around the world. And it is that which we remember and commemorate today on Good Friday. It struck me that in our text, the roles seem reversed. Those in power, so generally those who are accused of corruption, in this case Pilate, the occupier and oppressor, the leader of the Roman occupation, see no issue with the accused, with Jesus. But they are swayed by the loud baying mob. The leaders, Pilate and Herod, sat in judgment and then passed this power to the masses. Neither Pilate nor Herod intervened when they had the power to do so. Nor, for that matter, interestingly enough, did God, Jesus' Father, later during the crucifixion. Jesus' fate was very much in the hands of the people, of humans. Therein begins my personal rejection of the concept of an interventionist God, or the belief in that concept. For me, this is one of the key messages of the text and of the crucifixion of Jesus. Jesus was passing the baton to us humans, changing our view, our perception of God, and constantly reminding us that God acts through us, not to us, that right to the moment of his death, and in fact in the very act of his dying, this is what he's telling us. We have an imperative to act, to do something. Being from Melbourne, I think it was a football coach who once said something like that. Of course, Melbourne, a football coach. Who else would I quote? Just do something. But for me, it's the best thing to come out of football. Act. Act because, as we know from another Bible text, by their deeds you shall know their faith. Act, but do not judge. Judgment of others comes so easily to us humans. It seems to be a very common human flaw. Perhaps we have just evolved to be suspicious of others. It's perhaps a sort of defense mechanism. And it is a human failing that Jesus already also spoke of when he challenged us to remove the log from our own eyes, or for those without sin, to cast the first stone. Jesus preached compassion and forgiveness, and to the very end when he intoned, "Father, forgive them." Today, we see this judgment constantly, and particularly in social media. The loud shouting around issues or individuals that really don't involve those or have any impact on us, and yet so many jump to comment. Opinions are shared, and sadly, often in very threatening and violent terms. Sometimes I think that we really haven't evolved so far at all. Added to this, while we reflect on human nature, I'm also drawn again to the reflection on the Bible and judging its contents and judging its validity. That's always a challenge also. Looking at it with an open mind, I again consider context and perspective to be the key. If we consider it all to be nonsense, yet we find in it so much that is clear and logical and so clever if considered in that context, it would have to be the world's oldest and greatest con if it held no value and truth at all. It's ironic that at this time of fake news and you have your facts and I'll have mine, I find it ironic that those who challenge the many scientific claims based in evidence, that they are then happy to accept faith and ideology. And particularly where they rely on science for so much else. It's very rarely that we would second guess an oncologist in their suggestions for treatment for our cancer. But why then would we challenge a climate scientist around the world that is changing around us? Climate came to mind recently when reading the Royal Auto magazine. I found an image that I thought worked well and that I would share with you. It's not at my level of IT yet to have been clever enough to have this image now pop up on the screen. So I'm just going to hold it up in front of the camera and I hope you can see it and I hope this works. And if you have the recent Royal Auto magazine, you'll be able to look for it yourself for later. But I'll just hold this up. I hope you can see that. And you'll notice it's a power pole, power lines still attached. But the centre of the pole is burnt out. The stump is still in the ground. The top of the pole is still there, suspended by the very wires that it once held up. So now the situation has been reversed and it's the power lines that are holding what remains of the power pole in place. And of course, if you look at that symbol for just a moment, it's not very hard to leap from that power pole to what it is that makes today such a significant day, the cross and the crucifixion. Very clever image, whoever's the photographer that spotted that. It must be such a common scene, that image, after a fire, but for me it presented so many connections to what I wanted to speak about today. the privileges of having electricity, power, so essential and such a symbol of the evolution of mankind, that we've been able to harness this energy and put it to good use, and how we take it for granted that we flick the switch and the light comes on, and how we struggle when there's a power outage, even for just some minutes. Furthermore, the symbol of that necessity, that life necessity image, the power being destroyed by nature, by fire, perhaps caused by climate change, a result of our consumption and our production of that very energy, that electricity, here particularly in Victoria through brown coal. The wires also reminded me that our grasp on life can be slender. Our understanding of the world and the universe around us is the same. We've become very clever, and yet there is still so much to understand. Like those power poles that are now supporting, those power lines that are now supporting that burnt out pole, they're stretched taut to breaking point. They're now under intense load. Roles can be reversed so very quickly. Situations can be reversed, and without warning, especially to our health. And that's where we find ourselves today. Those taut, stretched power lines also remind me of the oh-so-slender tethers that we have to those things that organise our community, our society, the laws, the morals, the values, the very fabrics of our society. And often at times of challenge like these, they are such a thin veneer, and we very quickly slide back into basic behaviours of self-preservation. It's a reminder that we are imperfect, and the behaviours that we recently saw around the great toilet paper frenzy are, for me, a very clear example of that. So how do we maintain that? How do we keep that going? Well, we need that challenge to remind us of the good. We need the bad to remind us of the good. It's there to test us. And just as Jesus himself was tested so often, and finally that ultimate test on the cross. This Easter, we are presented with the real challenges affecting us all, regardless of race or creed, of socioeconomics. It was reassuring for me to see how many in our communities and our society have very quickly turned outwards to support neighbours, sometimes just with a simple greeting, offers to go shopping. Social media has been put to great use. Even just down to the simple things of having teddy bears in windows and rainbows chalked on driveways. And I hope you've been able to enjoy those as we have as a family on our generally daily walks. The challenge is a reminder that we have to work at and maintain and strengthen those slender, taut wires that support us. We reflect and we renew from Good Friday, following through to the rebirth, the symbol of Easter Sunday, the renewal and symbol of rebirth. And it seemed to me then an appropriate time just to briefly return to the basics. What is it that we believe? What is it that we're aiming for? What better way to do that? I thought I'd start again with our guiding principle, our motto: set your mind on God's kingdom and his justice before everything else, and all the rest will come to you as well. It's a very brief statement, and yet also encapsulates so much. As Templars, we believe that human beings have something of the divine within, and so they are the spiritual temples of God. Through God's creative powers, we are given a free will, albeit as humans, limited. We are called to work on ourselves constantly. There's that challenge that I've been talking about. Work on ourselves and the world of which we are part and for which we share responsibility. This links very clearly to my conviction that the divine is in us and the divine acts through us. It is this divine spark that separates us from all else, from all other life forms, but that also makes us more responsible to care for all those other forms. We have the choice to listen to our conscience, if you like, and we then have a further choice whether to act in response to that voice and how we will act in response to that voice. As we've often said, it's that simple, and conversely, it's also that hard. We try to follow the teachings of Jesus and his central message about the kingdom of God as recorded in the New Testament and as summed up in the twin commandments: love God with all your being and love your neighbour as you love yourself. In this central message of Jesus, the founders of the Temple Society saw a clear definition of humanity's task in the world. They believed, as we still do today, that this task can be carried out most effectively in communities of people with the same focus. The aim of the Temple Society and its individual members is the fulfillment of what Jesus envisaged as God's kingdom on earth by putting his message of love into practice in daily life. Templars are people who accept the responsibility of conscientiously working towards the achievement of this aim. To us, Jesus is a human being, divinely inspired. He taught us and he showed us by his example the essential guidelines we should use for our lives, striving for the kingdom of God by trusting in him and by loving your neighbour as yourself. For Templars, Jesus suffered death as a consequence of his unwavering faith in God's coming kingdom and his unwillingness to make any compromise with his adversaries. He remained steadfast in his conviction that God is a loving God who wants humans to live without fear and need. His preparedness to suffer even death expresses his dedication to his task and his trust in God. So his death has meaning for us, but not the meaning that is preached by many other churches of the past and today still. God needs neither Jesus nor our sacrifice to exercise forgiveness. Jesus' resurrection is to us a spiritual event. We acknowledge it as a manifestation of a spiritual existence and its effective working beyond death, potentially possible for all humans. We can say nothing more about that as we cannot possibly really know about that. What is expressed in the resurrection story is a metaphor, a pictorial description of an inner experience of people who had a very close, and some not even that, relationship with Jesus. The stories of Jesus risen from the dead show the great charisma that had evolved from this exceptional man. Martin Flanagan, a writer from The Age, once wrote for a Good Friday piece, Good Friday is about universal heart, how it is endlessly injured, how it triumphs because it never stops. So let us turn from the dark of Good Friday and prepare ourselves for the light of Easter Sunday with renewed and reborn conviction, with our minds and with our hearts, and thus bring more light to the world. And to conclude, a poem and a blessing. The poem is from a book that we have here at home, a children's book called In Every Tiny Grain of Sand. It's quite simple. There is a light that shines. beyond all things on earth, beyond us all, beyond the heavens, beyond the highest, the very highest heavens. This is the light that shines in our heart. I like to think that this light is our divine spark. Let yours shine, not just in your heart, but outwardly from your heart. I would like to take this opportunity to wish you, your families, and your loved ones a joyous and safe Easter time, and hope that you too may experience and be thankful for the love, hope, and at the moment, limited freedoms for which we all strive in our small community, as well as in our wider community, virtually today, physically again in months to come. Let that universal heart, your heart light, shine strongly, especially today, but also every other day as well. Be kind and be safe. And as we strive here on earth to work on the kingdom of God by following Jesus' living earthly example, especially in this time of challenge, this time of coronavirus, let us ask, may the Lord bless us and keep us. May the Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon us and give us peace. Happy Easter, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My big thanks to Ange for holding my virtual hand through this process. The most intimidating piece was the technology, not the service. We're very keen to get some feedback. There's not a whole lot I did differently today other than speaking to a camera, and I certainly missed faces in front of me giving me that whole range of feedback that I get. So feedback will be critical for us on how we move forward with our services. It was no frills today, and I missed the opportunity to sing, but we'll improve as we go. So we'll be very open to feedback. And I'll now throw back to Ange and see what we do as our next step in this. Thank you, Ange.